So I'm going to talk today really about kind of brain health and focusing on the context, since it's Fitness Day, of the benefits of fitness, exercise, and movement on brain health. And I'll kind of weave in a couple of other little things along the way. Just a couple of my accolades, as Jen said. So I'm a PhD researcher. My PhD is in biomedical science and neuroscience. I did my postdoc training at the National University of Natural Medicine in Portland, Oregon, focusing on kind of the intersection between nutrition, cardiometabolic disorders, private health, and public health. So kind of a lot in there, and then eating disorders. I'm currently an associate professor at the National University of Natural Medicine. I'm also the founder, director, and CEO of the Nourished Research Institute, which is a 501c3 organization that uses research to empower change in a variety of different healthcare aspects. I'm a behavioral health coach. I have certifications in integrative nutrition, basic nutrition, sports nutrition, weight management, and personal training. I think that's everything. And then I'm also an adjunct. I don't think I included this. I did not. I'm also an adjunct professor at Europa University here in Boulder, Colorado, in their graduate and undergraduate programs. So I thought I might start by offering a little tool that I use with clients when I'm starting to kind of build a health coaching program or relationship. And this tool I call the wheel of abundance, or the wheel of primary nourishment. So in nutrition, a lot of folks think of nutrition as being the food that we put on our plate that nourishes our bodies. I think of that as being one piece of nutrition, and primary nutrition, I really think as being all of the different ways that we nourish our bodies, our minds, our souls, and our lives outside of the secondary foods that we put on our plate, but that's a part of it. So with clients, I'll often go through this wheel, and we'll just kind of ask, if the center is a 0 and the outside is a 10, in terms of maybe satisfaction, where are you falling in these different elements on this wheel? And we'll kind of map this out. So we'll look at spiritual health, creativity, finances, career, education, health, physical activity, home cooking, home environment, relationships, social life, and joy. Now, these are all little pieces of the pie, but the reality is they're all connected. And so when one of these things gets out of balance, everything else on the wheel can get out of balance. Here's just kind of a reiteration of these different elements. And these are really, in holistic health and naturopathic medicine, these are really kind of the main factors that we tend to focus on when we're thinking about any type of health: physical health, mental health, relationship health, community health, etc. Today, we're going to focus a little bit more on physical activity, but as I mentioned, these are all related, so these other elements might come in. And it's not just me that focuses on these different elements of health. These are also really core elements and strategies for optimizing brain health, reversing cognitive decline, reversing Alzheimer's disease, and improving mood and function. And this figure is actually pulled from a 2023 publication that's from the work of Dale Bredesen, who's a naturopathic researcher who studies Alzheimer's disease and really these kind of multifactorial approaches for treating and preventing Alzheimer's disease. So the cognitive elements that Dr. Bredesen focuses on, that most kind of holistic health approaches focus on, are nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress, stimulation, detox, and supplements. And again, today we're going to really focus mostly on exercise. So exercise has a lot of benefits for the brain, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to use a couple of different words interchangeably: exercise, movement, physical activity. A little bit later on, I'll kind of start to differentiate what I mean by those. But for now, I'm going to use them all interchangeably. So movement stimulates or increases new brain cell birth and growth. So neurogenesis is the term that we use that describes the birth of new brain cells. And this process occurs throughout the entire lifespan. We're having new brain cells born and growing in our brain. Neuroplasticity is a term that we use to refer to the ability of brain cells to form new connections with one another. So that's really like the cellular mechanism that enables learning. When we can have new brain cells grow and form new connections with one another, then we can form new neural pathways that can enable us to have new thinking patterns or new behavioral patterns or approach things differently, whether that's just with a different mindset or a different behavioral pattern. This neurogenesis and neuroplasticity are kind of the active mechanisms that enable growth and learning. And they're fueled by this protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. BDNF is like steroids for your brain cells. It helps them get born. It helps them grow. I used to call it fish food, but I think steroids is more appropriate. So these are two really big benefits of movement, is that it stimulates the birth of new brain cells and the ability for new brain cells not just to grow, but also to form new connections with one another. So movement can really help enable learning and cognitive adaptation and resilience. And part of how it does that is by stimulating BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And then movement, of course, also can increase blood and oxygen flow to the brain, which really just helps support these processes. Some other benefits of exercise really protects the brain. It buffers the brain against stress. Stress hormones like cortisol have some pretty negative impacts they can on the brain, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail later. Exercise can buffer that. It can reduce inflammation and neuroinflammation. There's a whole area of work I could touch on the gut-brain axis and the way that the food that we eat can evoke inflammatory responses or inflammation in our body and in our brains. And when we get inflammation in the brain, that's really strongly associated with mental health. So things like depression, anxiety, addiction processes, when we get stuck in behaviors, even just that we don't really want, eating junk food, things like this. A lot of that process often is inflammatory. And then exercise improves insulin sensitivity. Insulin can act in the brain as a neurotransmitter, and it does. So being able to have insulin regulation, good insulin regulation, is important, not just for physical health, but also for brain health and for mood and emotional health. And then, of course, exercise strengthens the brain. So it can optimize our body mass index, which in turn, it can help stabilize our brain volume. So the volume of our brain, keeping all those cells good, alive, healthy, strong, functioning, and it can decrease white matter lesions. And this is just a little visual of kind of everything that I just went over. And I'm going to go into these elements a little bit more in depth, each of them, but just wanted to give you something, a little new visual here. So again, exercise, physical activity, movement, it can promote new brain cell birth, neurogenesis, and synaptic plasticity, the ability of cells to form new connections with one another in the brain. It can increase brain activity and brain volume. It has all these other good benefits for other cells, support cells in the brain like astrocytes, and then it can upregulate these trophic factors like BDNF, which is that kind of steroid for brain cells. And in turn, this is kind of at the neurobiological level. At the cognitive psychological level, what that translates to is improvement in executive function. So we can have better self-regulation, better regulation of our emotions, less impulsivity, less compulsivity. We can have better processing speed, which becomes increasingly important as we age. Just the ability to take in information and process it and engage with it. It can improve our learning and our memory, and it can improve our behavioral performance, so how we behave and how we go through things. So I mentioned neurogenesis, this process of new brain cell birth that occurs in the brain. So here we're seeing a human brain on top. This little orange, almost looks like a comet coming through, is called the hippocampus. Most people from the Brett Kavanaugh trial maybe know the hippocampus. The dorsal part of the hippocampus is involved in kind of learning and memory. The ventral hippocampus, or the underbelly side, is involved in regulating our stress responses and emotions. The hippocampus was the part of the brain that I did my dissertation work on, specifically looking at the impacts of stress hormones like cortisol on the hippocampus and how that how the hippocampus interacts with all these other brain regions, enabling stress to really have a very significant impact on our mood, our feelings, our behaviors, things like this. So when we talk about, oh, I'm stressed out, that's not just psychological. There's a very real neurobiological underpinning to that. Another really important thing about the hippocampus is it's the first brain region where we discovered neurogenesis. And so it was the first part of the brain where we discovered that, hey, there are these brain cells that are growing throughout the lifespan. We just 20 years ago, we used to think that only happened in this little teeny part of the heart. And now we know, like, nope, actually happens all over the body. And in our brain, we have new cells being born and growing all the time. And that's really a synonym for kind of life, not just life in the brain, but our life. So down on the bottom, I'm just kind of giving you a little visual figure of neurogenesis here. And there we go. Okay, I got to move. I've got something on my Zoom tool in the way. There we go. So the main point that I want to emphasize here is we have these little neural progenitor cells in the brain. They kind of live right near the blood vessels. They're supported by these other cells, astrocytes. They start to grow into neuroblasts. And this would be kind of the equivalent of like a child neuron. This process from birth to, kind of fully developed neuroblast takes about 2 weeks. Then they start to develop into an immature neuron or an immature brain cell, and then they start to mature. We can also look at this up here as proliferation. This is where one stem cell is putting out a lot of babies, having a lot of baby cells. Differentiation, where the cell goes through the process of becoming the type of cell that it's going to be, similar to a human, where we kind of come into adolescence. And then in this immature and mature neuron phase, this would be like young adult, adolescent, young adult, and adulthood, where we really start to mature and, we've differentiated, we are who we are, and the focus is on can we survive and are we surviving? Now, this whole process from proliferation, from birth to mature development takes about, this figure says 4 weeks. It's really about a month and a half, so 6 weeks. And then another maybe 2 weeks for the cell to really get integrated into a network in the brain. I think that's pretty important to note because one of the huge benefits, as I just mentioned, of exercise is that it can stimulate new brain cell birth. But it's going to take about 2 months for those new brain cells to develop and grow and get integrated into a system. So it's going to take about 2 months before you really start to feel the cognitive brain benefits from that exercise. As I mentioned, I work as a behavioral health coach. I do a lot of different techniques with clients around stimulating neurogenesis. Exercise and movement is just one. And I kind of give this disclaimer to all of my clients right in the beginning that, like, we're going to be doing these things. They're going to be new and different. And inherently in that, it's going to be a little bit hard. They might feel a little bit uncomfortable. And it's going to take about 2 months before you really start to reap the full benefits and really start to feel like, okay, I've got this. And I actually usually give about 3 months. 2 months is like if you fast track the system. So about 3 months before you're going to really start to see changes, but then you're going to see them in full force. So this is just a little zoom in on neurogenesis again, kind of same thing. I just wanted to give a close-up of the timeline. So neurogenesis is really life in the brain. So we're going from these glial cells, support cells, to progenitor cells, to an immature neuron, to a full neuron. Here they're showing a timeline of about 42 days and then another 2 to 3 weeks for integration into the system. And again, this occurs primarily in the hippocampus here. Whoops. Okay. So we have a lot of research showing that neurogenesis improves cognitive function and mood. So when we're stimulating birth of new brain cells in our brain, that significantly, strongly translates to improvements in our cognitive function, in our memory, in our ability to take in sensation, and integrate things, and our response time and our mood. Conversely, when we have death of cells in our brain or damage to cells in our brain, or the cells in our brains get old, that also significantly correlates with cognitive function and mood. So here I'm showing just two kind of outcomes of cell damage or cell death. One is depression or major depressive disorder. When we see our radioglial cells kind of not surviving, that really strongly tends to correlate with depression. And then on the other hand here, Alzheimer's disease and these kind of cognitive symptoms often associated with Alzheimer's disease and dementia. That's also associated with death of brain cells, and it's usually that immature neuron stage, so the cells aren't surviving. Depression, often it's more like the cells aren't being born, or they're not differentiating. And then Alzheimer's disease, they might get to become a mature neuron, but they're not surviving, or they'll get to be an immature neuron. They're not surviving. The important part here is cell birth correlates with cognitive function and mood positively. Cell death or cell damage also correlates with cognitive function and mood. So cell death causes cognitive decline. So what causes cell death? These are things like chronic stress, aging, if we have poor diet or a diet that doesn't support our brain cells, that is going to contribute to the development of Alzheimer's disease or major depressive disorder, or a variety of other negative health factors that can go on in the brain. And it's because of the impact that stress, aging, diet has at the cellular level on our brain cells. Conversely, though, we can do things or bring in factors or have factors in our lives that have positive benefits on our brain cells. Antidepressant medications like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors is a really common or obvious factor. But the reason that SSRIs or antidepressant medications are effective is because they enhance the serotonin that is available to our brain cells. How is serotonin helpful to our brain cells? Well, it has a lot of benefits. It can protect our brain cells. It can buffer against stress. Also, it stimulates BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is that steroids or fish food for our brain cells. I think that's important to note because there are other factors that we can bring into our lives as well that can also do that. And in fact, exercise, I'll touch on this in a few slides, has been shown to stimulate BDNF and new brain cell birth and improve mood and reverse depression and Alzheimer's disease at the same magnitude as antidepressant medication. So the same magnitude as Prozac, which is kind of considered the gold standard. Diet is another intervention. If we, just by making nutritional changes, dietary changes, where we're really eating to support our brain cells, that can increase brain cell health, which will in turn increase brain health, cognitive function, and mood. Having very mild, controllable stress, kind of working with our stress system and our ability to tolerate stress, resilience, this kind of good stress or eustress can be really good for our brain cells. The key point when we're thinking of stressors, this can be exercise. This can be weightlifting, things like this. The key is that it needs to be mild and controllable, something that we're controlling, and then predictability usually helps as well. And then another factor that we'll talk about, novelty and stimulation to our brain. Novelty and stimulation and navigation are so healthy and so good for our brain. Our brain is just like it's this sponge that is growing, and it just wants to keep learning and keep being stimulated. And it's really, that adage, use it or lose it. The more that we can stimulate our brain, and especially if we can have an element of novelty, which is inherently stimulating, the more our brain is going to thrive. And stimulation can look a lot of different ways. Exercise is a way of stimulating the brain. Movement is a way of stimulating the brain. Eating stimulates the brain. Just getting up and moving into a different room, or a different spot in our room stimulates the brain. And I'll go through a little bit more of these factors later. So I'll just kind of curb it there. The main point is brain cell health. The health of the cells in our brain really equates to overall brain health. So if we want to have a healthy brain, if we want to improve our mood, if we want to delay, prevent, or reverse Alzheimer's disease, We want to start thinking about our brain health, and we can really just take that down to the individual cellular level. How can I be kind to the cells in my brain? It's almost like if you want to take care of a forest, take care of the individual trees. Okay, so these good factors can kind of reverse also these negative factors. I have a lot more things here. Okay, so brain cell birth and death mediate brain health, mood, and cognitive function. So the important question then becomes, how do these environmental factors alter brain health? And I've kind of given that away already, but the key is BDNF. It is a steroid for our brain cells. Here's a little picture of BDNF so you guys can remember it. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor, it's like fish food or steroids for our brain cells. Our brain cells just eat it up. So we kind of walked through this timeline already, this process of neurogenesis and brain cell development. It's all dependent on BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. BDNF doesn't just mediate brain cell growth and birth and development, but it also mediates neurodegeneration. So when we have a lot of BDNF on board in our brain cells are going to be happy, they're going to be reproducing, they're going to be growing and thriving. When we get deficient in BDNF, we're going to get neurodegeneration. Demyelinated lesions in multiple sclerosis are associated with deficiencies in BDNF, and they can be reversed by BDNF. So just like I said before, neurogenesis, brain cell birth, having it is good, not having it, not so good. BDNF is central to that. Having BDNF in our brain is fantastic for the brain. If we're not having BDNF in our brain, that's not so good for the brain because BDNF supports brain cell life. BDNF also mediates not just neurodegeneration from mood. So here's just a table with a whole lot of research showing BDNF levels are associated with Alzheimer's disease, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, Parkinson's disease, schizophrenia, and epilepsy. So in all of these, increasing BDNF in the brain can actually delay and even reverse these processes. And if we get deficient in BDNF, that can result in these processes. So the big question then is, how can we stimulate BDNF, right? And physical activity is one great way to stimulate BDNF. BDNF can actually be secreted in the body and in the brain. So when we exercise, we are going to be stimulating BDNF peripherally in our body and in our blood. And it has a lot of great impacts there in our body. It can help us regulate autocrine function and stimulation. But then it also, that BDNF in our spinal motor neurons and in our brain are really what we're going to focus on here. And it's specifically, again, that brain region, the hippocampus, where when we get BDNF in the hippocampus, it's just like the perfect conditions, right? I want to make one quick point that exercise doesn't just stimulate BDNF. Our muscles are like pharmacies. Our muscles house so many hormones and BDNF and calcium, all these things that are so good for our body. And when we exercise, we're kind of like, it's almost like if you think of your muscles as a wet rag and you're wringing it out. So we're just going to get all of those good hormones and myokines. Myokines are like just the really good, juicy food that's stored in our muscles that when we exercise, they're going to be secreted into our entire body. And these all get released when we just move our bodies and move our muscles and kind of shake things out or wring things out a bit. So just to give a little bit more research on this, there's a whole line of work on this concept that our muscles are really our pharmacies. And a lot of the myokines or the substances, the molecules that our muscles store and that get released into our blood when we exercise or when we move, they're associated with hope. There's actually a lot of really cool, like really strong, valid biomedical research showing that exercise and movement, whether it's running, jogging, walking, weight training, and I'll get into all of that in a little bit, that all releases these molecules that are called myokines or organokines into our blood. And for a human, that translates to a perception of hope. So exercise increases hope. Our muscles are our pharmacies for hope. And it is the hope, those hope molecules, that can reverse depression and that have such really good benefits in the context of mood. And BDNF is one of those. So here's just another visual. These are just all of the things that our muscles release when we work out, that they store and then release. BDNF, which I mentioned, is one in the body that helps stimulate muscle regeneration. So in the body, exercise is going to secrete BDNF that's going to help us maintain muscle mass, which is so important for health. It's going to increase fatty acid oxidation. Oh, am I going backwards here? I'm going backwards. Okay. It's going to release IL-6, which is this anti-inflammatory cytokine. So that's going to help us reduce inflammation. Remember, I said inflammation in the brain is associated with depression and anxiety, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease. So IL-6 can help reduce that. So exercise movement can help reduce that. It can help reduce muscle atrophy. Those are just the two, but you can see there's a ton here. So our muscles are really our pharmacies for hope. These are just a whole lot of other factors that can be released when we exercise, and all of the benefits that they have really in the entire body. So a bunch of immune cells are going to be released from our muscles when we exercise. GLP-1, which is all the rage right now with Ozempic, insulin sensitivity, right? We know that insulin resistance has really negative impacts for physical health and for brain health. And when we exercise, we're going to stimulate the release of GLP-1 from our GI tract. We also get all of these good anti-inflammatories. Then we have benefits to bone health, tumor, liver, adipose tissue, and of course, the brain. So this is just a little disclaimer. If you are really interested in this concept of our muscles being pharmacies for hope, the Rich Roll podcast has an episode with Kelly McGonigal, and she talks all about this. Kelly McGonigal is a researcher who does a lot of this research. So there's links in here if you're interested and you want a great just podcast episode on that. So again, going back to this concept of neurogenesis, exercise enables us to secrete BDNF. It stimulates BDNF, and that can stimulate neurogenesis. So just one more visual to hammer the point home here. When we're doing aerobic exercise or resistance exercise, so we can be cardiovascular, running, jogging, walking, or just like lifting some light weights or even lifting a heavy box, that's going to have a couple of benefits for the brain. One is it's going to stimulate BDNF, which again is that steroid or fish foods for brain cells. That's going to stimulate this whole neurogenesis process, which we already mentioned has all of these great benefits: enhanced memory, increased cognitive function and mood. And then again, it's also going to stimulate blood flow and oxygen flow in the brain, which is going to bring that BDNF into the brain from the body, and it's going to support the process of cell birth and growth. So we're getting kind of a two-hit benefit here from exercise. This is the same visual again. I just wanted to regroup us all here for a minute. So these are just some of the cognitive benefits of movement. Movement simulates neurogenesis. The question then is, what kind of exercise, right? And this becomes increasingly important as we age, when maybe our exercise abilities become a little bit more limited, or we want to be a little bit more careful with our bodies. So what kind of exercise do we need to do to support brain health? How much exercise do we need to do? How long do we need to do it for? How hard does it need to be, right? These are all conversations I have with my clients all the time, no matter what age they're at and no matter what their physical ability is. So going back to this figure, you'll see here at the bottom, voluntary running. I bring this up because a lot of the what we know about the benefits of exercise on the brain come from animal research. And really, it comes from a model which we call voluntary wheel running. So you'll have a rodent and you'll put a running wheel in the rodent's cage or in the rat's cage. And then the rat can run whenever it wants to on that wheel. And let me see if I'm going to spoiler. Okay. So, when I talk about this with clients, we know that if you have voluntary access to exercise, movement, running, that's really good for the brain. It stimulates BDNF, as you're kind of seeing here, and it stimulates mood. These are just some ways we assess mood in rodents. They have more joy, they find more value, they'll engage in things longer, they'll become more resilient. But if you take two rodents and each get a wheel in their cage, One rodent gets to go on that wheel whenever they want, and the other rodent is kind of like yoked to the first rodent. So when rodent A goes on the wheel, rodent B has to go on the wheel. When rodent A speeds up, rodent B has to speed up. When rodent A gets off the wheel, rodent B has to get off the wheel. For those two rats, voluntary wheel running is really beneficial for rodent A, who gets to choose when they engage, how long, how fast, etc. For rodent B, it's harmful. It actually kills brain cells and destroys brain cells, and that translates to reduce cognitive function and mood. So the really important thing here is that exercise needs to be voluntary, right? And when we translate that to humans, there's a few things that we usually don't think of. Because there's a few things that often motivates humans to exercise that a rat isn't thinking about. With my clients, a big one is, body, kind of how we look. Like we're approaching summer now, it's swimsuit season. I'll have a lot of clients come to me and they'll say, oh, I want to get in my swimsuit shape. Let's exercise. A rat doesn't go on a wheel because they want their swimsuit body, right? A rat doesn't go on a wheel because they ate a cake yesterday and they feel guilty about it. A rat just goes on a wheel when it wants to run, when it wants stimulation. And that's a good way to give the brain stimulation, right? A rat doesn't speed up on a wheel because it wants to keep up with its other rat friends or look good for its other rat friends, right? It speeds up when it wants to speed up. So for humans, we have all these other factors that sometimes we need to navigate when we're thinking about exercise and movement. And I think as we age, that gets to be really important because movement looks different for everyone. And it looks different for everyone at different points in the lifespan, right? So as we might get older, and I can relate to this myself. I used to be a professional athlete. I no longer am. So movement for me these days doesn't mean I'm trying to run the way I used to run when I was training and racing. It means I'm trying to capture the way I felt when I was training and racing. I don't care about the speed. I'm going for what feels good in my body. When do I want to run? When do I want to stop? And sometimes for me, honestly, that's like, I'll run 2 blocks and be like, okay, I'm good. Go back inside and keep working, right? So we need to really remove our own expectations around what we think running, exercise, movement should look like. Okay, so here's some other research showing the benefits of exercise on brain health. Physical activity can have benefits at the molecular level and specifically in the hippocampus. The kinds of physical activity that we know in the research are good for the brain. They're simple. Free living walking, going for a walk. That can even be just walking down the hall, walking to the mailbox and back. Super simple. Free high intensity interval training. Now that can be a little bit, harder, but just something where we're getting our heart rate up and pumping, right? That doesn't need to be anything big. If you want to sprint, that can be, sprint down the driveway and back. If you have an exer bike and you just increase your speed a little bit, so your heart rate's going up a little bit. Anything, again, I mentioned novelty. Anything that we do, whether it's exercise or otherwise, where we're having change, that's going to stimulate our brain. And so that's going to stimulate BDNF. So if we're walking, maybe we add a skip or 2 in there, or we change up our speed. Or if we're sitting, we get up and walk, right? Any change the brain really loves. That's going to increase BDNF and all of these other good neurotransmitters. It's going to reduce cortisol levels. Cortisol is that stress hormone that can be really bad for brain cells. Walking can increase hippocampal volume. So it's going to increase just the whole strength and volume of our brain. And then again, this can be walking long distances. It can also be walking short distances. It can be walking up a flight of stairs in a multi-floor building, right? Little simple things. So the key takeaway point here is, as long as we have bodies, we can stimulate them and we can move. And as long as we can move, we can support our brain health. It doesn't need to be these big, crazy things. Whatever you can do is great. Even, if you're sitting, just changing the position that you're sitting in can be fantastic, So these are kind of some formal exercise recommendations for brain health. And I do want to I put this slide here to just make the distinction. When we think about exercise from a neurobiology standpoint, we think of kind of 2 different types of exercise: aerobic exercise and resistance or muscle strength exercise. So aerobic strength exercise is just anything where you're changing your heart rate. Your heart rate's kind of increasing, then it maybe goes down, your breathing rate might increase or go down. Again, any type of change is good. It doesn't need to be you're sprinting until you're vomiting, or until you're passing out. Just any little change can be great. Changing the heart rate, getting the heart rate going a little bit, getting the blood pumping. And then muscle strength, which is, we're maybe not even altering our heart rate in muscle strength. This might be things like lifting weights. And again, that's going to really just like wring out all of those good molecules from our muscles into our body. And then again, this can increase cognitive function, memory, it can reduce the risk for Alzheimer's disease, it can reduce adiposity, reduce inflammation, reduce neuronal amyloid beta plaque, which is kind of one of the underlying mechanisms for Alzheimer's. It can increase brain insulin signaling, and of course, it can increase BDNF in the body and in the brain. And I think okay, cool, we've got about 10 minutes left. Oh, and then just, so some examples here. Let me go back. Oh, okay. So cardiovascular, just brisk walking, swimming, cycling, general yard work, even a dance class, jogging, heavy yard work, high intensity interval training. All of these are going to have benefits. And then, the kind of recommendation is 150 minutes per week of moderate activity, whatever that means for you, just where you can feel, okay, something's going on here, and we want to really stay in tune to our body. There are certain conditions where exercising too hard, that can be really bad for the body, right? So it's really having a relationship with our body and listening to our bodies and just staying at what feels good. And then with strength training, just 2 days a week, something as simple as 2 days a week. If you have free weights, lifting some weights, even stretching, pushing against a wall, using resistance bands, calisthenics, yoga, things like this, tend to be really, really good and sufficient. So voluntary movement is really what we want for brain health. Starting when you want to start, stopping when you want to start, even if that's 30 seconds later, and going at the pace you want, no matter what that is. Those are the kind of key takeaways here. Feel free to pause in the middle of a class. If you're in a group aerobics class and you feel done, cool, feel free to pause. Feel free to get up and leave. Feel free to leave class early. Go at your own pace. Jen's like, don't leave class early. I'm just kidding. So that's brain health. And real quick, I've got about 7 minutes left. I want to hold some good time for question and answers if anyone has any. But I wanted to talk also about, we just talked about physical exercise. I want to also talk about mental exercise or brain stimulation. And so this is just kind of another area that's really, really beneficial to the brain. And when we're talking about mental exercise or brain stimulation or cognitive training, we're talking about things like novelty, which is just doing anything new. Diversity, again, anything new. Having a lot of change, right? Whether that's change in your heart rate, change in your environment, change in what level of engagement that you have. These have really good benefits on memory, on attention, and on executive function. So we know this, again, kind of coming from animal research. And the environment that an animal lives in has a significant impact on their brain health. So here on the left, you're seeing just like a standard cage that a lab rat might live in. Maybe they have another rat in there with them. If they do, that's really, really beneficial for them. Engagement with other human beings or other animals, other life forms is really good for the brain. If you enrich the environment of that cage, so you give the rat like a playground, that hyperstimulates the brain in a good way. It stimulates BDNF, so you're going to get just this wave of brain cell birth and growth and new connections in the brain. And it's those new brain cells and then those new connections that enable us to actually have new behaviors, and go through things differently. So I just wanted to show you, this is what actually a lab rat's cage looks like. They have this kind of fodder on the bottom, and there's this little, we call this enrichment, and this is the size of about 1 to 2 cotton balls. And if you just take that, kind of break it up and throw it in the cage, that alone is enough to stimulate increased brain cell birth and development and growth in the brain. Just that alone, 2 cotton balls. So when we add something like a whole playground, and here's a picture of this, that the brain just loves that. I like to share this analogy because I think it's pretty key, right? It makes this factor, this environmental factor, really accessible. If all a rat needs is 2 cotton balls to increase their brain health, what can we do in our own lives to have that type of stimulation, right? That's pretty easy. And so we might think about, how can we engage in our environment in a more playful way? If we go into a different room, that's going to be a new environment. That's going to be stimulation. If we walk outside, that's going to be new stimulation. If we have toys, maybe we play with a bouncing ball or a puzzle or a game, that's going to be stimulation. So the impacts of stimulation on the brain, they're similar to exercise, but different types of stimulation have different impacts on the brain. So if we're looking at this yellow rat down here, who's kind of looking at this ball and experiencing visual stimulation, that has one type of benefit. So we can get visual stimulation by changing landscapes, going outside, looking at landscapes, even watching movies, looking at art. The point here is just visual. We can take in stimulation visually without even moving or, moving at all. Then this green rat that's on the wheel, he's getting obviously motor stimulation, or she. Motor stimulation has another host of benefits. We can get motor stimulation by things like walking, moving, stretching, running, all these. And then this red rat here, or orange, who's exploring, is getting cognitive stimulation. So cognitive stimulation are things like novelty, exploring, taking a new route. The hippocampus, that part of the brain that is, the hot spot for neurogenesis, it's also involved in spatial navigation. So, looking on a map, kind of thinking through directions, taking a new path to the mailbox or to the diner, or to visit a neighbor, meeting a new person, puzzling, putting together a puzzle, or trying a new hobby. These are all things that are going to be forms of cognitive stimulation for the brain and really, really beneficial. So environmental enrichment and all of these forms of stimulation, again, they're just so good for brain health. They have positive impacts on our genes and our DNA, and they have positive epigenetic impacts. So they can make modifications to our genome that we can then hand down to our, children and children's children as well. So I'm just kind of pulling from another study here, Khalil 2024. They were looking at creating a model for ways that BDNF can support neurogenesis, so new brain cell birth and growth in the hippocampus, that part of the brain that's really the hot spot for that. And so here we're seeing the brain. We're seeing that stress right here is generally not great for the brain. That can result in depression or poor cognition, things like Alzheimer's disease. But on the other hand, when we have enrichment through our environment or through stimulation, that's going to increase growth factors like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, and neurotransmitters. And that tends to be really good for the brain. Now, if we're living in urban environments, sometimes the amount of stress in those environments can override the benefits of stimulation. So natural environments have just all these great, great, great benefits for the brain, just a few of which include stimulation of so many different kinds. We're getting visual stimulation. We're going to hear birds chirping, auditory stimulation. We're going to smell all these good smells. While we're smelling, we're going to take in all these good botanicals and tannins that are just naturally given off from like pine trees and grass and fruits and things in nature. So as much as we can get outside and just be in nature, super helpful for the brain. So going back to this chart again, where we're looking at, we already kind of walked through the benefits of physical activity in the brain. And I just want to highlight here that this table is also identifying mindfulness, meditation, natural environments, and cognitive training as being good for the brain. And these are all forms of stimulating the brain. Usually we don't think of exercise as a way of stimulating the brain, but to the brain it is. We're getting stimulation. So if we can't move, then we can defer to these other two types of stimulation. So environmental enrichment or cognitive training. And I'm just going to go through these here in the last kind of 2 minutes that we have. So we walked through physical activity already. Cognitive training, when we're bringing in novelty, diversity, that's going to improve our memory, our attention. Also, if we're engaging our memory, if we're trying to actively remember things from the past, if we're actively focusing our attention on things, if we're actively using our executive function, it's that kind of use it or lose it. So that has a lot of benefits. All of these things are going to stimulate BDNF within about 5 weeks at the cellular level, right? And then it's going to take another maybe 4 weeks for that cell to really get integrated into the system. At the, kind of neuroanatomy level, we see diversity and spatial learning increase hippocampal volume. So spatial learning is just learning how to navigate through space, right? That can be taking a different path to the diner. That would include diversity, trying new things, doing new things, changing our posture a little bit, trying to balance on one leg. That's going to be a form of spatial learning and diversity. So there's all these different levels of things that we can do. Route learning, I've mentioned, spatial complexity, artwork, looking at new artwork, dynamic natural scenery, just looking at landscapes outside, and then social interaction. So huge and so good for so many different reasons. It's a great form of stimulation to the brain. You're also going to get a big oxytocin boost. Oxytocin is this bonding hormone. It is a hope hormone as well. It reduces anxiety, increases hope. You're also going to just so many good things from social interaction. And then mindfulness. So these kind of what we usually think of as more contemplative Buddhist practices, originally things like mindfulness, meditation, are so good for the brain. I can't stress that enough. So good for the brain. Just 4 2-hour little sets of mindfulness can rapidly stimulate BDNF. More long-term, again, that's in about 5 weeks. So just that same kind of timeline, the timeline that brain cells grow on doesn't change. We're going to get good upregulation of serotonin and dopamine and good reduction of cortisol. Mindfulness doesn't change the volume of the hippocampus, but it protects neurogenesis from the adverse effects of stress and inflammation. So it's really protective. And a lot of times, when we think of meditation or mindfulness, we think like, oh, I need to go, hike up to the top of a mountain and sit in lotus pose with a gong and all of these things. That's not really what mindfulness or meditation are. Mindfulness is just awareness, bringing presence to the moment. So, an immersive, multisensorial, natural environment can bring mindfulness. Biophilic design, and I'm not even going to go into that. That's a big word. Just looking at an environment and spending a moment admiring a flower, or the color of the flower, or the sound of a bird, or just taking in that environment as a whole, or the way that it smells, the way that the sun feels on your skin, the way that you feel when you look at sunlight. All of these things are mindfulness. What we're really doing is we're just increasing our engagement in the moment. And that's going to increase the stimulation that we get from these things. And that's going to increase our stimulation in the brain. So we have a whole lot of research on the benefits of mindfulness in brain health. Just 8 weeks of a mindfulness-based stress reduction can increase cortical thickness. So that outside cortex of the brain will get more thick. It can increase thickness in the hippocampus. So that in turn is going to improve our learning and our memory. It decreases the size of the amygdala. The amygdala tends to be associated with anxiety, fear, panic, things like that. As it says, stress. And participants also reported feeling less stressed. So mindfulness and meditation, they are huge tools to being able to be the driver of your own mental health. And that includes your cognitive health, your brain health, your cognitive function, and your mood. So the benefits of mental exercise, again, it stimulates BDNF and neurogenesis. It stimulates connectivity of all the brain cells in your brain. It improves cognitive function. It reduces the risk of cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease. It can prevent and delay Alzheimer's disease and dementia, and it can improve your activities of daily living. In terms of cognitive function, all different types of cognitive function mindfulness can improve. So it can improve your hearing, your sense of hearing, sound, sight, smell, taste, touch, just by being mindful. It can improve motor coordination and movement. It can improve cognition, thinking, problem solving, and reasoning. So all these benefits. It can improve your temperament and mood. It can reduce depression, anxiety, impulsivity, compulsivity, rumination, hostility. It can increase patience, gratitude, compassion, joy, and, which I didn't include here, hope. And then it can improve memory. And that can include your working memory, your short-term memory, and your long-term memory. So stimulation, mental exercise, also so good for the brain. And before I wrap up, I just want to add a little plug here. I mentioned that I'm the founder and director of the Nourished Research Foundation, which is a 501c3 organization that uses research to improve access to physical and mental health resources. I also teach at Europa University in their clinical mental health counseling master's program. Europa University is a Buddhist-oriented university. This image here, you're seeing one of my students, Mihu, who is a Buddhist nun. Mihu was ordained and entered the monastery at age 13. She recently earned her master's in clinical mental health counseling. She joined us at Nourished, and we put together a 12-week course on mindfulness skills. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can scan this little kind of QR code that kicks off in August. We're offering that in an online asynchronous format, an online live format, and in person here in Boulder. It's donation based, so it's very, very accessible. There's many other courses like this as well. Mine is just one. It is not even close to the only course or thing that you can do to improve mindfulness. You can also go on YouTube and just Google, mindfulness. You'll find a lot of guided meditation, things like this. So I think I'll wrap it up there, and I'm going to stop the screen share maybe so that I can see everyone. And I think there's about 8 minutes left. I wonder if anyone has any questions.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
You talked about with your clients that you would work with them and that there were things you told them they were going to do that were uncomfortable or whatever, but the payoff, what kinds of things would you be doing with them?
Yeah, so I really specialize in behavior change. Most of my clients come to me, the majority of my clients, and now it's actually quite expanding, but they come to me usually when they have a health issue that they're not able to manage on their own, right? So, a large percentage of my clients are mothers who, they've kind of had kids in a short amount of time. They've reached overweight and obesity, and their doctor tells them you need to lose weight, because you're entering into all of these other health risks. Maybe they need to change their diet. I also now do have kind of an in-stream of clients who maybe are aging and they're just curious, how can I improve my health in, this next chapter of my life? My mom is at that stage, so I just kind of not really fun. So usually when clients come to me, they need to make some changes to their behaviors and their lifestyle. And I think at any point, change is never great. Even if we're going to make a change that's better for us, I'll only speak for myself. Even if I'm making a change that I know is going to be better for me and good for my overall health, and I might want to do it, there's an inherent reluctance to change. And that's because change in itself can also be a stressor. So when I'm working with clients, the changes that we might make, they're not big. And usually that's why clients start with me. They think they need to make all these crazy changes. All of clients come to me and they'll say, I'm overweight, I need to lose weight. And if I ask them, like, what do you think you need to do? Or what have you tried? They're like, oh, I've tried every diet under the sun. None of them has worked. I've tried fasting. I've tried running 2 marathons, all this crazy stuff. That's not what we do. And that's not what is good for the body. So a lot of the work that I do with clients is really just like honing it back and being like, what is the smallest individual unit of change that we can make? That might be like, can you walk to your mailbox this morning and back? And we start there. You walk to your mailbox for a week. Can we do that a little bit more? Or one thing I do with myself, like, can you go strike a conversation with a stranger? That's not always super comfortable, but it's really beneficial. One of my students just did their master's thesis, who we're actually about to onboard as well, on ecstatic dance, which is this form of dance where you play music, you don't have to have any knowledge of how to dance, and you just move your body to the music. And you do it in a room where other people are doing the same thing. And at my student's capstone presentation, he had us do this. And I was a teacher and I was doing this with my students. And I was like, I don't know, feels very uncomfortable. I don't know what we're doing. But afterwards, man, it was amazing. I learned so much about myself. It felt so great. So that's the kind of, I call these things type 2 fun, where, this is nothing crazy, but it's just something new. And there can be an inherent discomfort in trying something new.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? So I think it'd be safe to say that we increased our BDNF by listening to this lecture. Yeah.
Hope so.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Bray, for joining us today. We'll give her a round of applause. And I'll leave you with more questions about everything that you do. So thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Bye.